Hi, I'm Dave Welch. I'm the president of the Texas Pastor Council and host of the Christian Citizen podcast. And we are an organization of, by, and for pastors to bring a united biblical voice to key issues of the day, to restore the concept that our citizenship is a legitimate ministry of our local churches, and to lead ourselves back into an active voice in that, shaping our culture, shaping our government. And today, we have an issue that we have been involved in for many years as a pastor team. In 2010, due to the rising anger and hostility toward the concept of illegal immigration, the many different voices out there, including in our churches, a group of our pastors came together and formed what we call the Pastors' Declaration on Border Security and Immigration Reform. We had pastors from over 20 states sign on to that declaration, and that was basically just a statement of principle. We were calling on our legislators, our elected officials at the federal level, state level, to listen to and heed in terms of addressing this issue. And here we are 15 years later, and once again, we have a border crisis, immigration enforcement issues, and a lot of anxiety and concern out there. And one of the men who has been a great resource and assistance to us over these years has been one of the most influential immigration attorneys in America. Charles Foster served as an immigration advisor to President George W. Bush and President Barack Obama. Has been one of the leading immigration attorneys for years, and those who would like to pursue more information about him and his firm, it's fosterglobal.com. He's taken the time to join us today briefly to share some thoughts on some current issues regarding what's happening right now following the new Trump administration. Mr. Foster, thank you so much for all that you do and for your time. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Glad to do it. Your mission is a very important one, and so I'm glad to be supported.
Well, a couple of the key issues I just wanted to address with you today and to share your thoughts on. We've been hearing a lot of concern coming out of particularly, obviously, our Hispanic churches, but others, in a couple of reasons. One of which was that the reported removal of the sensitive locations designation for churches under Trump's executive order, and really what results and consequences it may have for churches and the kind of historic sanctity of the church gathering and so forth. I just want to run that by you and get your input on that issue. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Unfortunately, you're correct. The sensitive location, that was a understanding and agreement that was put in memorandum form going back a number of years, at least 2011 or earlier, with ICE and then subsequently with the Border Patrol, which is sort of common sense. I mean, they, frankly, as we all know, the enforcement side of immigration has a huge task because technically anyone that is undocumented is subject to removal. So they really didn't have to focus on churches, on the sanctuaries of the church, because they could go to virtually any work site in America in terms of enforcement. So in terms of both schools and churches, they were considered off locations that were not appropriate for enforcement. Now, that sensitive location memorandum withstood the first Trump administration. They did remove schools, but they did not remove churches. And now, at the beginning of the Trump administration, they did remove churches as well. And what that means on paper is that ICE could technically enforce immigration laws, go into a sanctuary, and remove someone that they determine was unauthorized. Now, as the expression goes, easier said than done. So I'd like to make, before there's a great concern about that, I think there's less to that than what may appear. Tom Homan, who was the ICE director under President Obama and has been an advisor to President Trump and now has been appointed as border czar and his spokesman, justified that in terms of going after criminal aliens. As we all know, the vast majority of those individuals that have not been able to regularize their status, they have no criminal convictions. They're just people that have come here for a better life. So I believe removal of churches and schools was part of this, what we call shock and awe of the Trump administration. I think a big part of that was to create an atmosphere that would result in self-deportation, that individuals would be afraid. They would say, nothing is safe. They're after me, so I might as well go home. Remember, President Trump has promised over and over again mass deportation. But in reality, that's going to be very difficult for the president to bring about for a variety of reasons, one of which is he has the same deck of cards that have been dealt to him in terms of resources that President Biden had. Now, they're going to have different enforcement policies on the border, but in terms of internal enforcement, President Trump, to do anything significantly different, would have to obtain significantly increase funding through Congress, which I think he can get. And secondly, even if he got that funding tomorrow, he would have to train up a lot of individuals. So I do not believe, for a variety of reasons, common sense, from a PR point of view, I do not think that the Trump administration wants to see a DHS agents with their flak jackets and guns going into churches when they have many other opportunities, frankly, to enforce U.S. immigration laws. One more thing, and I'll stop talking. We represent a lot of employers that have the same concern. I do not expect churches would want to do this, but technically, the church could say, before we admit you, you must have a warrant. Now, they can backfire, they can go get a warrant, but I just wanted to point that out.
Okay, well, and that's an important point of distinction, and I think that's a great illustration of what the intent is on this. And I think, again, as we understand that President Trump has made it very clear, the top priority are those with violent criminal records, either from their country of origin or here in this country, as a matter of public safety. But the general worst nature of the generalities of if you're here without proper documentation is that you're essentially living outside of the framework of the protection of the law, and there's that vulnerability too. So automatically generates some unrest and concern in general. But I think what I'm hearing from most of our pastors is just that specific concern, how it's immediately affecting the church itself. And most of the Hispanic pastors that we work with and served with over the years and still are part of our network, have people that are undocumented or here illegally coming to their church. But one of the things that isn't commonly known, and I'm sure the numbers have changed probably a little bit on this, Mr. Foster, but one of the realities too people need to understand is that many, it seems like, if I remember correctly, maybe even half or more of those that are here in this country without documentation, that are here technically illegally, simply overstayed visas.
Right.
Is that still fairly close to being accurate?
I can't say precisely, but for many years, it was more like 60% were overstays, came in on a visitor's visa. And the vast majority would have come in on a visitor's visa and simply never went home. And some of it might have been students or some work visa that expired, as opposed to the numbers that crossed the border without inspection. And so I think you're right, approximately 50-50, but people will focus almost exclusively on the border.
Well, especially I think with the visuals we've been dealing with in the last several years of the caravans, coming up and over, and just absolute disrespect for our border and sovereignty, that this has generated so much of that frustration. I think that's where a lot of this is coming from. But what we really believe at the end of the day, that the Trump administration is approaching this with balance and, like you said, the similar limitations to some extent. And they're not looking for the people that are out there working hard and have families and are involved in the community and so forth. But at the same time, if you're here without that kind of documentation, there are ways in your firm and others like that offer a lot of those services and information expertise to help people navigate some of those processes. And so that's what part of our mission here as an organization as well has been to say, pastors, if you have people in your church that are living outside of that framework of the law and are here, but with some effort and some help and paperwork, could at least get some legal status. And then they've got to get busy and help make that happen. One other quick question, Mr. Foster, one of the things that's been put out there too, that, well, they're going after these violent criminals, but they're also catching up, and maybe even a number, as many as half of those deported so far do not have previous criminal records. You know what the kind of the latest reports are on relation to that breakdown?
Yeah, I think those reports are accurate, and I'll tell you why. The Trump administration has a conflict. It's not like there are large numbers of criminal aliens that are not already caught up in the system one way or the other. Because interestingly, whatever one might think of the Biden or the Obama administration, their policy was almost exclusively to focus on the arrest or removal of criminal aliens and not just sort of ignore others. The Trump administration, both terms, came in and said, no, everyone technically is subject to, if they're subject to removal, well, that's what the law is. We're not going to exempt anybody. So they've changed the enforcement priorities so that everyone is potentially subject to removal, with the caveat that you've mentioned, that they're going to focus primarily on the removal of criminal aliens and those with outstanding deportation orders. The conflict is the Trump administration wants to keep up the numbers And they cannot always find, from day to day, they cannot find a sufficient number of, quote, criminal aliens or people that have outstanding deportation orders. And others, they may go after someone with a criminal record, but they'll find 5 other people, so that they are taking them in. 2 other quick points. Even though this policy has changed, an ICE officer always had the authority, even under the sensitive location memorandum, they could get a supervisor to override that. In other words, an ICE officer could say, yes, that's our policy not to go into a church, but in this church, we have reason to believe there's this bad actor. So all I'm saying is there's probably less substance to the change. I think a lot of it is more PR. And you said something else I want to emphasize. There are a lot of good people out there that remain here without permission, cross just for a better life. And they should, I think I would tell your pastors, that the best thing those individuals can do is go to a reputable attorney. Here in Texas, you could determine that if they're board certified in the field of immigration law by the State Bar of Texas. And just like you would want to go to a doctor to get a checkup. Now, that doctor he may not be able to promise you have perfect health or good health or everything's okay, but at least to know where you're standing. And the reason I say this is every day I hear these stories of individuals that we're talking about are very vulnerable, and they can be taken advantage of. I might tell them, for example, that they have a difficult path forward, but there are people out there, so-called notario públicos, who are not authorized to give legal advice, and sometimes lawyers who do not know better or not very scrupulous that will say, pay me so much and I'll get you your papers. But when we look at the fact pattern, within 5 or 10 minutes, I know that person was being exploited because there was no viable path forward. We have to accept the fact that we have an extremely restrictive legal immigration system, and not everyone qualifies. But the individuals in the church at least should know what their legal standing is and what their rights are, even though there may not be a perfect answer that they're looking for.
Absolutely. Look, and from this biblical standpoint, pastors, we understand that Scripture calls upon us in Romans 13 to be in subjection to those in governing authorities. And that doesn't mean that we're to surrender and submit to any possible tyrannical act of government. What it does mean is we're to be good citizens and respect the rule of law. And that includes those that have come here in violation of our laws. Doesn't mean they're always bad people. It just means that they can't choose to violate the law and then expect there not to be consequences for that. At the same time, and part of our reason for that declaration was also to say there is a balance line always with justice and compassion. And that's what we're talking about, Mr. Foster, is we can't strike that. That was our kind of the third point of our declaration, was this, after saying we have to secure the border. Number 2, we have to deal with the broken and bureaucratic immigration system. And third, we have to deal humanely and justly with those that are here. And that includes separating them into legitimate categories, starting with those that are here engaging in criminal act, they need to be removed. And secondly, there are those who are here just to work. They don't really want to become citizens, but they want to be able to work here legally and send money home. And then there are those who are here who do want to become citizens. Do we want those people to stay permanently in the shadows of our country, or do we want to help them become effective, sound American citizens? And that's where some of the differences of perspective can come in. But our objective immediately was to help dispel a lot of just the anxiety and fear we're obviously seeing rise up out of predominantly in the Hispanic community, bring that calm and balance back to it, understanding that there are laws and there are consequences for breaking those laws. But at the same time, let's work with our leaders, pray, and then find ways for those leaders to enforce the laws and reach out for expertise. And that's where I want to just commend you. And we'll be calling on you again, Mr. Foster, possibly as you've done graciously in the past, to speak to our pastors and to be able to share that counsel. And folks, once again, best, sound, experienced counsel on this issue in the country. fosterglobal.com is the website. And if they can't serve you, there are others maybe they will direct you to. I just want to thank you, Mr. Foster, for your service to our country, your expertise on this issue, and your heart for people that is so evident.
Thank you very much.